When two officers forcefully removed a black man from an airplane, they had no idea who they were dealing with. This wasn't just any passenger, it was a highly trained Secret Service agent. What happened next will shock you. Agent Carter settled into his seat on the commercial flight, his expression neutral but his senses sharp, alert to his surroundings. A skilled Secret Service agent assigned to high-level officials, he had been selected to covertly protect the president, who would be boarding shortly. Dressed in plain clothes to avoid drawing attention, Carter kept his focus on his duty, discreetly monitoring the aisle and passengers boarding. He adjusted his posture slightly to conceal the holstered firearm strapped to his leg, a standard precaution for agents, even on commercial flights. As the plane filled with passengers, two police officers, Officer Myers and Officer Grant, entered and made their way down the aisle. Their eyes moved over each face, scanning the cabin as they walked to their seats. When they saw Carter, a young black man sitting alone, their gazes lingered, curiosity shifting quickly into scrutiny. They exchanged glances, eyebrows raised, as they took in his appearance and demeanor, each silently feeding into the other's unspoken suspicions. The officers, both uniformed and seated only a few rows behind Carter, continued to observe him, growing increasingly unsettled. To them, something didn't feel right. They couldn't understand why a black man, especially one with an air of quiet authority, was seated on a plane with the president about to board. Their suspicion began to grow, overshadowing any logical explanation, and they leaned into their assumptions, thinking it unlikely he had any legitimate reason to be there. Can you believe they judged him without a shred of evidence? Stay tuned to Adam Alpha to see how this unfolds. Minutes passed, and with each passing moment, the officers' doubts solidified into certainty. Finally, unable to restrain their suspicions, Myers and Grant stood, stepping into the aisle and making their way over to Carter. Their expressions were guarded but edged with hostility. They stopped beside him, their stances confrontational as Myers spoke first, his tone flat but probing. "Sir, can we see some ID?" Myers demanded, his gaze fixed on Carter with a hint of accusation. Carter looked up, surprised but calm, noting their tone and stance. He could see the suspicion in their eyes, a weariness that seemed out of place but very familiar. "I'm with the Secret Service," Carter said, keeping his voice level. He moved slowly, reaching for his identification, but the officers cut him off, dismissing his response. "Secret Service?" "Sure," Grant muttered, his skepticism plain. "And what are you doing on this flight?" "I'm here on official business," Carter answered simply, hoping to diffuse the tension, but the officers' expressions only hardened, their disbelief deepening. As Carter shifted in his seat, Grant's gaze dropped, catching sight of the firearm strapped to Carter's leg. His eyes widened in alarm, and he immediately drew back, his hand moving to his own holstered weapon. "He's got a gun!" Grant yelled, his voice carrying through the cabin. "Everyone, stay calm. This man is a threat." The announcement sent a ripple of panic through the passengers, who began murmuring nervously and glancing at each other in alarm. Before Carter could respond, both officers drew their guns, aiming them directly at him. "Get down on the ground!" Myers shouted, his tone commanding. Passengers gasped, some ducking instinctively while others stared wide-eyed at the unfolding scene. Carter raised his hands slowly, his voice steady but urgent as he tried to explain. "Please, let me clarify. I'm authorized to carry this weapon." "I'm here on duty," he said, meeting their eyes, hoping reason would break through their hostility. But his words fell on deaf ears. The officers were too far gone in their assumptions, their fear of what they believed he represented blinding them to any logic. Ignoring his protests, Myers reached for Carter roughly, grabbing his arm as he forced him onto the ground. Carter winced but complied, aware that resisting would only escalate the situation. His hands were restrained behind his back, and he felt the cold bite of the cuffs on his wrists as the officers searched him, stripping him of his personal items, including his Secret Service badge. They pocketed it without a second glance, too fixated on their perceived threat to examine it closely. Myers and Grant exchanged a grim nod, certain they had neutralized a serious threat. Their shouts for calm continued as they secured Carter's weapon, treating him with the severity they reserved for a known criminal. Carter lay on the ground, his face pressed against the rough carpet, frustration simmering within him. He understood too well that his skin color, combined with their assumptions, had made them see him as a threat first and a person second. The officers wasted no time hauling Carter to his feet, keeping his hands bound tightly as they escorted him off the plane. As they walked him down the aisle, passengers stared, some whispering in shock, others simply watching with wide, fearful eyes. Carter's heart sank. He wanted to assure them that he was no danger, that he was there to protect, not harm, but the officers kept him moving, their expressions set in stone, their suspicions unchecked. As they exited the plane, they led him through the terminal, drawing stares from onlookers as they made their way toward the airport security office. Carter's mind raced with frustration and concern, knowing his absence could compromise the president's security. But despite his attempts to explain, the officers ignored him, too committed to their mistaken narrative to question their actions. Once inside the security office, they roughly pushed him into a seat, their eyes cold and unyielding. "You think we're just going to take your word for it?" Grant sneered. "We're going to find out exactly what you're up to." Carter met their stares, his jaw clenched but his gaze steady. He knew that the truth would come to light eventually, but in that moment, bound and stripped of his authority, he felt the full weight of their prejudice, a barrier that no badge or rank could break. Despite Agent Carter's repeated attempts to identify himself, the officers pressed him harder, refusing to listen. Each word he spoke seemed only to fuel their suspicion. Ignoring his explanations, Officer Myers and Officer Grant pinned Carter down against the rough carpet of the airplane floor, securing his hands tightly behind his back. Carter winced as they forced him into handcuffs, his efforts to stay calm growing more difficult with each dismissive shove. Passengers watched in stunned silence, some whispering among themselves, others craning their necks to get a better view of the spectacle unfolding before them. The officer's harsh treatment of Carter made several onlookers frown in confusion, yet no one dared to intervene. From his position on the floor, Carter scanned the faces, hoping for a glimmer of understanding, but the officers left him no chance to clarify. They pulled him roughly to his feet, ignoring his Secret Service badge as they patted down his pockets, confiscating every item he carried with the air of men who had captured a dangerous criminal. "Out of the way!" Grant barked as they escorted Carter down the aisle toward the exit, ignoring his efforts to speak. "I'm on duty," Carter said, his voice firm but controlled. "I'm here for the president. Removing me could endanger him." But Myers scoffed, giving Carter a cold look. "Save it. You're done with excuses." In a few swift steps, the officers had removed Carter from the plane and began guiding him through the airport terminal, holding his arms tightly on either side. Carter could feel the weight of onlookers' stares, a blend of surprise and unease as they passed by. His frustration simmered beneath his calm expression, the reality of his situation becoming all too clear. These officers had already decided he was a threat, and no words of his would change their minds. Once they arrived at the airport security office, the officers shoved him toward a small, dimly lit detainment room. Carter stumbled slightly but steadied himself, taking in the sterile, confined space that now separated him from his duty to protect the president. They pushed him into a metal chair, the handcuffs biting into his wrists as he sat, facing the officers who towered over him with crossed arms and hard-set faces. For the first time since boarding the plane, a flicker of real worry crossed Carter's face. He knew that his absence could compromise the president's security, especially on a commercial flight where every second counted. Taking a deep breath, he looked each officer in the eye, hoping they'd finally give him a chance to explain. "You're making a serious mistake," he said, keeping his tone steady but forceful. "I'm part of the Secret Service. I'm on assignment to protect the president. You have to let me go." But Myers shook his head, his expression both skeptical and annoyed. "Yeah, and I'm the Queen of England," he shot back, looking at Grant, who laughed. They both shook their heads as if the notion were too absurd to entertain. "You don't believe me," Carter said, his patience beginning to wear thin, "but I'm telling you, removing me from my post could put the president at risk." Grant rolled his eyes, crossing his arms tighter. "Right, and I suppose that's why you were armed, sneaking around on that plane, waiting for the right moment to cause chaos." Carter's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. "My weapon is part of my official duty. I'm legally permitted to carry it as a protective detail." Grant's eyes narrowed. "Enough with the lies," he snapped. "We know a cover story when we hear one. Now let's get to the truth. He took a step forward, folding his arms as he leveled his gaze at Carter. Who sent you? Who are you working with? Carter shook his head, his frustration rising. I'm not part of any group. I am exactly who I say I am, a Secret Service agent on duty. The officers ignored his explanation, continuing to probe with questions loaded with suspicion. How long have you been planning this? Myers demanded, his voice thick with accusation. What was your endgame here? There is no plan, Carter replied, his voice clipped. And there's no threat. I'm a federal agent tasked with protecting the president. That's it. But his words fell flat, drowned out by the officers' distrust. They exchanged a look, communicating wordlessly before continuing the interrogation, each question more aggressive than the last. They demanded names, affiliations, anything they thought could tie him to the threat they believed he posed. Each answer Carter provided was met with dismissive scorn, the officers doubling down on their assumptions rather than considering his identity. As the minutes ticked by, Carter felt his frustration deepen. He was bound, confined to a detainment room, treated as a criminal, all while the president, his charge, was left unprotected on the plane. Every attempt to explain had been met with derision or outright hostility, their refusal to listen underscoring the biases that clouded their judgment. Finally, with no recourse left, Carter fell silent. He'd said all he could, given them every answer, every piece of information they needed, but it was clear that the officers' minds were made up, their judgments cemented. He stared at them, his expression a mask of calm resignation, knowing that only time or a higher authority could break through the thick wall of prejudice surrounding him. Myers shook his head, casting one last glare at Carter before stepping out of the room, leaving him under Grant's watchful eye. Carter sat in silence, a mixture of anger and helplessness tightening in his chest as he waited, hoping that soon someone with the authority and open-mindedness would step in to correct the disastrous misunderstanding. What will happen when the president himself steps in? Don't miss the shocking twist on Adam Alpha. On board the plane, as the flight crew completed their final checks, a senior Secret Service agent noticed something strange. Agent Carter, assigned to protect the president on this flight, was nowhere in sight. This unusual absence raised immediate concern. Every agent knew the critical importance of staying within the designated security perimeter. One agent quickly alerted the president's chief of staff, who immediately felt a prickle of unease. The crew checked with airline staff, combing through records to find out if Carter had deboarded for any reason. The more they searched, the clearer it became that Carter hadn't left voluntarily, he'd been forcibly removed. It wasn't long before the story emerged that airport police had taken him into custody, accusing him of suspicious behavior. The president's face tightened with anger as he processed the implications. He's been detained, the president asked, his tone steely. And they're claiming he's a terrorist? The chief of staff nodded, his expression troubled. That's what the report states, sir. The president took a deep breath, reining in his frustration. He knew that Carter, one of his most trusted agents, was not only highly capable but also deeply dedicated. The idea that Carter would pose a threat was laughable, yet it was clear that racial bias had colored the judgment of those officers. For the president, this was more than just a security oversight, it was an insult to Carter and his team, and it put everyone at risk. Without Carter's expertise and vigilance, the entire protective detail was weakened. Hold the flight, he ordered, his voice low but firm. I'm going down there myself. The president and his team deboarded, navigating swiftly through the terminal until they reached the airport security office. The sight of the president and his high-ranking entourage entering the office caused a ripple of alarm among the staff, who exchanged nervous glances as they processed the unusual arrival. Inside, officers Myers and Grant stood, appearing smug as they told a colleague about the terrorist they had apprehended. The chief of staff stepped forward, his voice commanding. "Where is Agent Carter?" he demanded, his expression leaving no room for argument. Myers and Grant looked up, their expressions faltering as they registered the president's presence. Myers stammered, recovering just enough to answer. Agent Carter? We apprehended a suspect claiming to be Secret Service, if that's who you mean, sir." The president's eyes hardened as he looked directly at the officers. You apprehended one of my agents, he said slowly, under the assumption that he was a terrorist? Grant cleared his throat, looking increasingly uncomfortable. Sir, we thought it was suspicious a man with a weapon on the plane, claiming he was Secret Service. We were just doing our job. The president raised an eyebrow. And did he have credentials? Did he attempt to show you identification? The officers looked at each other, suddenly uncertain. Myers mumbled something about protocols and safety, but his voice trailed off under the president's steady gaze. The chief of staff gave a pointed nod, and an aide handed over the confiscated badge, confirming that it was indeed Secret Service issued. The officers' faces went pale as the weight of their mistake dawned on them. The president's jaw was set, his expression one of thinly veiled frustration. Agent Carter was here to protect me. His removal compromised the security of this flight and put my life and everyone else's at unnecessary risk, he said, his voice icy. Realizing the gravity of their error, both officers stood frozen, their confidence shattered. The chief of staff gestured to the door, and the officers quickly led the president and his team down the hallway to the small detainment room where they had been holding Carter. Inside, Carter sat quietly, his expression composed despite everything he'd endured. The moment he saw the president enter, his posture relaxed slightly, a look of relief flashing across his face. He had remained calm throughout the interrogation, knowing that the truth would eventually come to light, but the physical and mental toll was evident in his eyes. The president stepped forward, reaching out a hand to help Carter to his feet. Agent Carter, I apologize for this unforgivable misunderstanding, he said sincerely, his voice carrying the weight of his respect for the man who had been wrongfully detained. Carter nodded, accepting the president's hand and the apology with quiet dignity. Thank you, sir. I appreciate you coming down here, he replied, though a trace of exhaustion lingered in his tone. Turning back to Myers and Grant, the president gave them a look that spoke volumes. You both owe Agent Carter a profound apology, he said, his voice cutting through the room like steel. This type of racial profiling is not only wrong but dangerous. You judged him based on his appearance without giving him a chance to explain, and it nearly cost lives today. Myers and Grant shifted uneasily, clearly embarrassed, but managed to mumble apologies. We're sorry, Agent Carter, Myers said, his voice barely a whisper. We didn't know. Carter met their eyes, his expression steady. He nodded, accepting their apologies but leaving no room for excuses. The president turned to the officers once more. I hope this incident serves as a lesson. Racial profiling has no place here. It threatens lives and weakens the very security you claim to protect. With that, the president led Carter and his team back through the terminal. The officers remained standing, expressions a mixture of shame and disbelief as they absorbed the reality of their mistake. Carter walked alongside the president, his shoulders straight, his professionalism intact despite the humiliation he had endured. As they reboarded the plane, a quiet understanding passed between Carter and the president, a recognition of the obstacles they would continue to face and a renewed commitment to the duty that bound them both. Once freed from the detainment room, Agent Carter stood before officers Myers and Grant, his calm demeanor masking the frustration of the ordeal he had just endured. The officers' faces showed the unmistakable signs of shame, their confident expressions replaced by a mix of regret and discomfort as they fully realized the mistake they had made. Eyes downcast, they fumbled for words, barely able to meet his gaze. We're deeply sorry, Agent Carter, Myers said finally, his voice subdued, the weight of his error evident in each word. Grant nodded beside him, his face equally remorseful. They both knew that they'd acted out of misplaced suspicion, allowing their biases to cloud their judgment and cause harm to a man who had been doing nothing more than his job, a job that, ironically, was to ensure the safety of the very people they thought they were protecting. Carter listened, his expression neutral but his steady gaze leaving no doubt that he was taking in every word. After a long pause, he gave a small nod, accepting their apology but making it clear that forgiveness would not come without understanding. The tension in the room was palpable as he straightened, his tone measured and direct. Thank you for your apology, he began, his voice calm yet firm, but understand this, your assumptions, based solely on my appearance, nearly put the president's safety at risk. Racial profiling is not just wrong, it's dangerous. Today, it could have compromised a high-level security operation. Next time, it could cost lives. His words hung in the air, each one a clear reminder of the damage their prejudice could have caused. The officers winced slightly, as if feeling the sting of each pointed remark. Carter continued, his voice steady but unyielding. As law enforcement officers, it's your responsibility to look beyond assumptions, to base your actions on evidence, not biases. The officers nodded, their heads hanging as the gravity of his words sank in. They understood, in that moment, that Carter's presence on that flight had been crucial, and that removing him had left a critical gap in the security detail. It wasn't simply about him, it was about a lapse in their own judgment that had led them to overlook what they should have prioritized. The president, standing nearby, spoke up, his tone resolute as he addressed the officers. Agent Carter is one of our best agents. His position isn't earned easily, it's earned through skill, dedication, and commitment. You didn't just wrong him today, you failed in your duty to exercise fair and unbiased judgment. Racial profiling and assumptions like yours have no place here or anywhere. Myers and Grant nodded, each word from the president solidifying the lesson they had learned. They could feel the eyes of the entire room on them, each gaze a reminder of their serious misstep. The regret on their faces deepened as they exchanged a glance, the weight of their error pressing down on them. We understand, sir, Grant managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. It won't happen again. Carter held their gaze, a subtle expression of strength in his calm demeanor. Good, he replied simply, the single word carrying both warning and hope. The officers looked back at him with gratitude, visibly relieved that he was willing to give them a chance to reflect and learn from their actions. The president turned to Carter, placing a hand on his shoulder. Let's get back to the flight, he said with a nod. Carter gave a brief nod in return, falling into step with the president as they walked back through the terminal toward the boarding gate. They moved side by side, both men acutely aware of the larger implications of what had just occurred. As they reboarded the plane, the flight crew and passengers who had witnessed Carter's earlier removal looked on with a mixture of curiosity and understanding, some even offering brief nods of respect as he passed. Carter, though outwardly composed, felt a deep sense of relief returning to his post, his purpose as clear as ever despite the challenges he had faced. Meanwhile, back in the security office, Officers Myers and Grant stood in silence, reflecting on the incident. They knew that today's events had forever shifted their perspective, a harsh reminder of the critical importance of fair judgment and trust in the people around them. Racial profiling had led them to question and humiliate an innocent man who had been performing his duty with utmost dedication. The regret they felt was sharp and real, a lesson they would carry into every encounter from that day forward. As Agent Carter resumed his place on the flight, he glanced briefly out the window, the events of the day playing through his mind. Though the experience had been unsettling, he felt a renewed commitment to his role, recognizing that moments like this were why he served, to ensure that everyone, even those who had wronged him, could live free from harm. For Carter, the experience had underscored the importance of standing up to prejudice and holding people accountable for their actions, yet he knew the real victory lay in their willingness to learn. Don't miss more powerful stories like this on Adam Alpha, where we shine a light on justice and accountability. Disclaimer: the events and characters depicted in this story are fictional and not based on real people or occurrences. This narrative is meant to engage viewers through imaginative storytelling. Viewer discretion is advised.